Okay, off we go with the second lecture. Notes up here, hopefully. Looks right. Okay, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins election in the 1932 election year. As we know, there's a delay between when you win election and when you're sworn in. He gives his inaugural speech on March 4th, the famous speech with "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." At that speech, as we discussed last time, he issued the call for an emergency session. That emergency session begins March 9th, and it begins what's known as the 100 days. It's an emergency session in Congress, and it lasted exactly 100 days. It wasn't set up to be 100 days. He just called for an emergency session, and the session began, and it lasted exactly 100 days. And so that has been sort of the metric that's been used to rate presidents, is how they perform in that first 100 days ever since. Okay, so the special session begins, and this special session, this emergency session, reinforces the notion of an emergency and that the facts and the fact that things were getting done. So this is reinforcing Roosevelt in the eyes of the people. And this is major legislation. We're going to go through some of the bigger parts of the legislation. I'll talk about the first couple, and then we'll get to what's called the alphabet soup grouping of legislation, because they're known by their acronyms. But the first order of business, at his inaugural speech, he called for a bank holiday, closing down banks around the nation. Some of these places, the banks have been closed for a month or more in some of the more hard-hit states with these bank runs, states like Michigan, for example. So he orders this Emergency Banking Act, and he says we're going to examine all these banks and only open the banks that are trustworthy. So this is an idea of reinforcing the safety of banking for the American public. He also rushes through a piece of legislation, and I want to talk a little bit in detail about this legislation because it illustrates this sort of fear that's going on. Again, recent events always useful for reinforcing historical practices. The speed with which this third funding bill went through Congress is somewhat analogous to this banking bill. So here's what happens with the banking bill. So the first day of this emergency session, some of the House members are still trying to find their seats, and they are presented with this piece of legislation, which is a major reorganization of the banking sector. It introduces a federal oversight role and involvement in banking that had never existed before. And so this is a gigantic piece of legislation, a gigantic change in the way the federal government interacts with the private business of banking, one that bankers had traditionally refused, but now banks are in such desperate straits, they're happy to take anything. So this legislation is so brand new that they gavel in the session at 12 o'clock, and there's not enough copies for the members of the House to read this legislation. So the Sergeant at Arms reads from the podium this piece of legislation, a major reorganizing of banking. And it's so new that some of the changes, some of the notations are still written in pencil, as in cross out this word, insert this word. So he reads this to the House. The House has a very brief debate about it and then immediately passes. Now, as you know from your schoolhouse rock, that passing the House is only one step on the way to legislation. So the bill is picked up, taken over to the Senate, where by now the Senate has copies of the bill. So the bill is introduced into the Senate. Now, again, the Senate is designed by the Founding Fathers to be the more deliberative component of our legislative branch. So the fact that they are supposed to think about the long-term implications of this, well, they read through the bill, they have a couple hours of debate, and then they shut off the debate and they have a vote, and it passes the Senate. Same bill passed by the House. That bill is picked up, taken to the White House, where at 8:36 that evening, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs that legislation into law. A major reorganization and introduction of the federal role into banking, one of the most important economic sectors of the nation's economy, is introduced, debated, passed, and signed into law in 8 hours and 36 minutes. This is an example of the times, right? That people are fearful, and that the Congress is happy that somebody is going to take the lead, and that somebody is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The second piece of legislation that helps to illustrate this tenor of the times, let's say, is this is an effort to cut back the expenses of the government. So the president asks for federal workers' pay to be cut, and also to cut benefits to veterans. Now, for those of you who are veterans or no veterans, you know that every election cycle, every politician talks about how much they care about their veterans, right? And this is also in the wake of the events that are associated with the bonus army, which absolutely sealed Herbert Hoover's loss in the election. So the idea of cutting workers' salaries during a depression and slashing the benefits of veterans, many of whom who are unemployed, it's a remarkable political statement. So, and also something in a practical sense, the way bureaucracy works is that the workers actually do things. So if the political officials want things to happen, they actually have to rely upon the workers in these various departments to make them happen. So if you want to ensure things don't get done, well, then irritate your workers, right? But that's not a good way to begin a new administration, by cutting their salaries. Also, Franklin Delano Roosevelt may not have to run for election for another 4 years, but every single member of the House is up for election in 2. And they can project into the future what their opponents are going to be saying. During the worst economic disaster this nation's ever faced, my opponent, the incumbent, voted to cut your pay and cut the benefits to veterans, right? So you can see this is a political hot topic. Nonetheless, Franklin Delano Roosevelt says we need it, so they pass it very quickly. Now the third one, and here we are 4 days into this 100 days cycle, third major piece of legislation that is being discussed, and it's to end prohibition. So prohibition in the Congress needs a little bit of a backstory. Prohibition was an intractable issue that could not be resolved, in which you had opponents on both sides who very passionately gave the same speeches. It is somewhat analogous, but certainly not as bitter and serious, as the debates Congress had prior to the American Civil War over slavery. Those debates became so entrenched and so bitter that Congress actually said, we're no longer going to debate slavery in the Congress, right? So they banned any debates about slavery on the floor of Congress because it ended up being the same formula. Well, you can go to the congressional record today and go back and flip through the pages where they discuss prohibition, and it has the same tenor. It's on one side, you have what are known as the wets, and the wets talk about, you know, all the jobs that are lost, how inconvenient it is, how this is fostering crime. And they go on for pages in the congressional record, giving this speech, talking about how awful prohibition is. Then you have the argument from the dries. Same thing, pages going on, completely paralyzing Congress with the same debate over and over, dries about how whiskey is the devil and all these things. So this issue had become so intractable in Congress that there was resistance to discussing it. March 13th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, we need to end prohibition. And the way he proposes it, I always find delightful, is that he says it's a jobs program, and not just the obvious jobs program of creating positions for brewers and distillers and putting them back to work, but also waiters and waitresses and bartenders, right? And then he even extends it to pretzel makers, right? Because when you're having a frosty beverage, it's delightful to have a salty snack, right? So all these things are promoted as we need these job opportunities and some of the tax revenue that come with it. So this issue has paralyzed Congress up until this point for a decade, right? More than a decade they've been arguing over this, and then virtually overnight they agree, they end prohibition. Now, of course, you as good constitutional scholars know that you can't and a constitutional policy by a vote in Congress. So they begin the process of unamending the previous constitutional amendment that was known as Prohibition. So what do? So they use what they can. And what they can do is they change the guidance on what this term means. So they define that malt beverages that are 3.2% alcohol and less do not fall under the strictures of this Prohibition Amendment. This is a way to get breweries to start brewing beer, albeit on a lighter alcohol content, right? So these are all steps that are taken immediately to address these problems. And this is day 4 of this 100 days. He's persuaded Congress to end prohibition, which now brings us to the alphabet soup of these bills that are proposed, right? So first I want to say, before we get too far into it, that oftentimes New Deals and Franklin Delano Roosevelt are viewed as radicals, right? And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt's a radical socialist who wants to change the way the government does business, and certainly the critics at the time saw his intent as bad and evil. The first 100 days, for sure, and in general, the New Deal is not really radical, and I'll explain why with some of these examples. That there's a host of legislation that is created in this 100 days session, and it is fundamentally not radical. It is unusual. It is out of step with the usual course of American policy making, but it is not radical because it doesn't fundamentally seek to change the way the government operates, right, and the way society operates. And I say that with the following caveat. There's 1.5 exceptions that are truly radical in this first 100 days. So let's talk about what these things are. So the legislation known as the AAA is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This is an act designed to help farmers, right? Farmers are in desperate straits. A difficult problem for farmers in general, which was particularly acute at this time, is the only way they make more money is to sell more of their stuff, right? And in selling more of their stuff, they grow more of the stuff, which puts more stuff on the market, which, with our simple supply and demand, when there's more supply and the demand is roughly constant, then the price of the commodity goes down. So the more you supply it, the more it drags down the price. So we had a very unusual circumstance in American farm life, the agricultural sector at this time, that farmers had an abundance of food and other things for sale, but nobody could afford to buy it. So you have this huge surplus that nobody's buying. The farmers can't make their payments. They're in debt up to their necks for mortgages on their property, for the very expensive equipment they have to buy, and their products don't return enough to justify the expenditure. In fact, a farmer would lose less money letting his crop rot in the field than if he harvested it and tried to sell it. Because in order to harvest it, he'd have to hire people to help him do it. And then he would have to deliver it to market, burning gasoline or diesel. And when he got to market, if it sold for such a low level, it didn't pay to actually get it out of the ground or off the trees. So this is a very unusual circumstance, and there's really no clear way to how to get out of this, right, without decimating the agricultural sector. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is designed to help them. This is the first iteration of a policy that continues unto the present day in a little slightly different format. And in fact, in the last few years under the current administration, has taken a new form altogether, in which there's just outright payments for farmers. In effect, farmers are paid not to grow stuff. That is true today, and it was true as a function of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The idea behind it is twofold. One, you get money into the hands of the farmers, right? So by giving them money not to grow stuff, you're giving them money in order to help them make their payments. By not growing stuff, they are reducing the supply of material on the market. that also means the stuff they do grow and sell is going to have a higher price. Both of these things are designed to help the farmers, right? Who does it not help? The consumers, right? So consumers have to buy this stuff. The government's practices are designed to make it more expensive, and I'll talk about how that works out in just a second. So in the future, paying farmers not to grow stuff is the aim of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right? And part of the policy that has remained very popular in the agricultural sector ever since. But in 1933, when this is being debated, there actually was too much stuff on hand already. And this is where it illustrates the difference between radical and unusual actions taken. A radical action would be for the government to buy up all this stuff and to distribute it free to the people, right? A radical approach would be to have farmers stop being independent competitors in a market economy and form them into some national farming sector in which they are compensated for growing food for the populace to eat, right? Those would be truly radical solutions. This ain't that, right? What this is instead is designed to tide over the market system until the market is prepared to reform and handle things in the normal way. So how does this work out in practice? There's too much stuff on hand. So the government buys the excess surplus, right? That is getting money into the hands of the farmers. And then they're going to pay them in the future. So next season, don't plant as much, and we'll pay you for the portion of the field you take out of rotation, right? But here, this year, 1933, we're going to buy the surplus stuff. And then we're going to destroy it. Because the idea is there's too much stuff on the market, so the price is too low. So by removing some measure of this excess, that which is still available will rise in price, making it worthwhile for farmers to grow, harvest, and deliver, right? So how does this play out in practical terms? So in Chicago, and again, this is only the first year because this is the year where there's a surplus and they're first introducing this. So in Chicago, the government purchased a bunch of pigs and took them to the slaughterhouses in Chicago to be slaughtered. And then instead of distributing free bacon, they destroyed it. And of course, memorably in the case of Chicago, some of the pigs got free when they're trying to bring them to the slaughterhouse. And so there was much to do about the government's free pigs running around and people trying to capture them, right? The logic behind it is if we give people free bacon, then they won't buy bacon from farmers. And so farmers won't make any money, right? Or any money beyond what the government's paying for them. So they destroy the product that they purchased. In fact, the government hired armed guards at city dumps, to make sure that people didn't come in and gather up the apples that the government had purchased and then discarded, right? Because if people are getting free apples, then they're not going to want to buy apples. The logic behind this is to help the farmers, right? But the flaw in this whole thinking is it's not that people didn't want to buy apples. It wasn't that they were trying to punish farmers by not buying the apples they were producing. People didn't have any money to purchase apples. So it didn't matter if the apples were 2 cents an apple or 10 cents an apple. They didn't have either, so they weren't buying them. But the Agricultural Adjustment Act is geared to protecting farmers, and it's designed to serve as a temporary bridge until the market recovers, right? And then the idea behind it is the government can step away from this, right? So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is a temporary emergency measure. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, is designed to deal with this problem of unemployment, particularly industrial unemployment, right? So the government is rightly fearful of the following thing. Unemployed young men get in trouble, right? It's true in history. Finding stuff to do for your young men to keep them out of trouble is one of the challenges governments have faced going back to the earliest settlements in the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys, right? So the Civilian Conservation Corps is designed to address it. It also reveals, along with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, this sort of inherent bias this nation has had against urban areas and conversely privileging rural areas. So in the cities, you have a bunch of unemployed young men. You have a bunch of unemployed people in general. But young men are particularly troublesome, right? They can be hanging out on street corners and radicals can turn them to radical action, or so the government thinks. So the government designs a program to address this unemployment, and it wants to address it in a certain way. It's going to hire these young men and then later some young women from the cities and then take them out into the dirty, vice-ridden cities, I should say, and then take them out into the good, clean, fresh country air and put them to work doing physical labor, right? This will be good for the individuals being removed from the city, and it'll also be good for the cities as well, in a way I'll discuss in just a second. So what do? So they take them into rural areas, they house them in dormitories, the government pays their wages, so it's a jobs program, but how they spend their money is severely limited, partly because they're out there in the middle of the woods or in the middle of nowhere housed in a dormitory, so there's not a lot of ways they could spend the money, but also as part of their contracts to join the Civilian Conservation Corps, they have to shift a certain percentage of the money back to their families, right? Parents, if they have children, whatever. So they're sort of regulated in how their pay is determined, but they're working for the government, so it's a jobs program. So what do? They put them to work fighting forest fires. They put them to work planting trees to create shelter belts against the high winds that are creating or helping to worsen the things known as the Dust Bowl. They cut trails in national parks. They build bridges in public lands. They build cottages, right? So if you want to, if you go to national and some state parks, you'll see the guest quarters in the corners. The cornerstone will say CCC, right? So they put them to work doing stuff for the government out there in the country, with good, fresh country air. This is a federal jobs program. This is unusual in American history. We haven't done that, but it's not truly radical because the underlying concept runs like this. One, getting them out of the cities will be good, where they can, in the cities, they can be turned to radical action. Out in the countryside, a good, fresh country air will make good Americans of them, right? So there's that aspect. And there's the other aspect of the logic behind it. Again, this is a temporary program. It's not seen as this, everybody's going to be working for the CCC in the future, right? So this temporary program follows under the logic that runs like this. Factories are shut down right now. When the factories reopen, they're going to start hiring back the unemployed. Factory owners would preferentially hire young unemployed men because they can work them harder, and because they're young and usually unattached, pay them less. If they have to hire older workers, those older workers tend to have families and dependents, and so they're going to demand more money. So the factory owners would prefer to hire unemployed young men first. And then as the economy recovers, then they're forced to hire these other workers. That's good for the factory owners, not so much for the nation, right? Because the thinking is that it's better if you hire older workers first because they have families. So the money that the older worker makes will support his spouse and their children and maybe their parents or whatever, right? But if you hire young men, the only people that are going to benefit are their bartenders, or so the thinking goes. So the logic underneath it is not radical. It's seen as a holding time for what they anticipate happening. The economy will recover, factories will go back to work, and then we can release these young men from the Civilian Conservation Corps who we have removed from the job pool. But underlying this is the expectation that things are going to return to normal in short order, right? In June, so here we are moving our way through 100 days, there's the creation of the Homeowners Loan Act, which, much to my dismay, is not known as HOLA, but is known as the Homeowners Loan Act. And this is designed to help the banks in the following way. Banks are facing a serious problem. People are not paying back their loans. So the way banks traditionally solve problems when people don't pay back their loans is they take either the item they have a loan on or their collateral, right? So people take a mortgage out on their house, they fall behind, and the bank threatens to boot them out. They're going to foreclose on the mortgage, boot people out of the house, and take the house back, right? Well, the problem, the logic behind this in general is then the house or that property or house could then turn around and be sold by the bank, and then they can make that money back that they loaned out to people in the first place, right? And so that keeps the banks whole. Well, the problem is nobody's paying back their mortgages because they're all unemployed, or a great amount of them are unemployed. So the banks are swamped with houses that they have to foreclose on. In addition, because very few people have money, nobody's buying houses. So the bank is getting back property that they can't turn around and sell to recapture that money. So the banks are in serious trouble because they're not getting the money back that they've loaned out, and they have no way to recapture that money, which means that banks are more likely to go out of business, right? So the government steps in, and the government says, we're going to give the banks money to forestall this foreclosure problem. Here again is an example of an unusual but not radical action. What would have been radical? If the government bought these loans out and then said, you're free and clear to the homeowners, right? If the government gave the money to the homeowners to pay their loans off, right, as opposed to giving it to the banks, that could be a little bit more radical, because then that would give more agency to the homeowners, right? But that's not what they did. What the Homeowners Loan Act did was the government bought these loans, making the banks whole. So if someone borrowed $100 for their house, the government bought that mortgage at $100, right? So the banks are made whole. They have gotten these bad loans off their books, and they have gotten the cash that they could then prop up their own business and maybe find people who are able to pay it back or whatever, right? So the banks are made healthier by this process. Then they turn around to the people who owe the mortgages, the people who live in the houses. They have been threatened with foreclosure. They have fallen behind on their rent, right, or their mortgage. So they're 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 months behind, right? And when they're behind, they also come with penalties. So if you don't pay your mortgage, you owe your mortgage and the penalty. If you don't pay your mortgage the next month, you owe 2 months mortgage plus more penalties, right? So the government says, here's what we're going to do. We bought these loans. You still have to pay for your mortgage. Only instead of sending your mortgage payment to your bank, you're going to send them to us, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? So what are we going to do for you? We're going to reset your clock, right? So you were 8 months behind on mortgage and penalties. We've reset it to 0. Some, very few cases, they renegotiated new interest rates. So the interest rates were too high, so they renegotiated them. Some of them. Most of them were the same mortgage rate, but they said reset your clock to 0. Again, the expectation is when the economy recovers, people go back to work, they'll start making some money, then they can pay off their mortgages. So this, again, is a holding effort, not a radical effort. It's designed to serve as a bridge until things recover, right? But here's the problem. The economy didn't restart. So the people fell 1 month, 2 months, 4 months, 5 months behind paying the federal government for their mortgages, as opposed with penalties, as opposed to owing their banks. So the unintended consequence of this is because the market did not recover, because people didn't go back to work, because they still owed their mortgages, that by the end of the year, the federal government was the largest evictor of people in the nation, right? They bought these loans, people didn't pay it. The only thing the federal government thought it could do to make these loans whole was to take the property back. So the federal government booted people out of their properties. Not the intent of the Homeowners Loan Act, but that's what happened, right? So I said that there is a radical, one full radical piece of legislation, and that comes in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a big dam project, right? It's a series of dams across the Tennessee Valley watershed that are designed to generate electricity. And there's a map, the TVA map is on Blackboard under information, course material, under course material, right? So this project is a massive federal effort to construct dams to generate electricity. Here's what makes it radical. The government generates this electricity and then turns around and sells it to the consumer, and sells it to the consumer in competition with private industry. Because in this nation at that time, utilities were owned by private corporations who charged what they wanted to sell it to their customers. In the case of the Tennessee Valley, this large watershed in the South, there was not a lot of electricity generation and delivery in that region. The power companies said, private entities said, it's too expensive to put this stuff in. So the federal government wanted to reverse this process, wanted to bring electricity to places that they saw as underserved, because it's inefficient not to have them using electricity to increase their productivity. So the government said, we're going to do it. And they're building these dams, power generating dams, with government labor, right? So they're hiring people, another jobs program, to build these programs known as a TVA. This puts the government in competition with private industry. This is radical. In this nation, the government does not compete with private business. In this case, the TVA is designed to do precisely that, to sell the electricity they generate in the market to consumers in competition to private industry. And private industry was charging a high rate for electricity. Part of this is because nobody knew how much it cost to produce electricity. Private industry said, oh, it's very expensive to do this, right? So we have to charge 10 cents a kilowatt. Well, how could you compare it? Nobody could see their books because it's private industry. There's utilities create what's known as a natural monopoly, in which it's so expensive to generate the electricity and deliver the goods that you can't have competition. You can't have 2 electric companies or 3 electric companies or 4 electric companies competing in a town, because it's so expensive to build the infrastructure of delivering electricity, the wires, the poles, and all that stuff. So it's a natural monopoly in which you have only one. So once the TVA came online, over the ensuing next couple of decades, the price of electricity dropped more than 90%. Because now the government knew how much it cost to produce electricity and what it could be sold for, and it undercut private industry's ability to do so. So that's truly a radical effort. It's even more radical in concept, because the idea behind the TVA was they were going to create a series of planned towns in which they're going to say, this is where the people live, here's where we put the school, here is X religion church here, X synagogue here, whatever, right? So it was designed to be truly radical, a planned state building and community that worked at the TVA. That part didn't quite come off, but the TVA in itself is a radical element. June 16th, the National Industrial Recovery Act. It's known as the NRA. I don't know what happened to the I, but nonetheless, the I fell out of the acronym. So it's known as the NRA. And the NRA builds upon this idea of voluntary effort in World War I. In World War I, the Woodrow Wilson-led effort relied upon a lot of public persuasion to do things. To be good, loyal, patriotic Americans, you went out and bought war bonds to fund the war, right? So a lot of that was support was ginned up by social pressure. You're having rallies and things. Every good loyal American buys material for the war effort. You plant victory gardens, etc. Right? So the NRA is designed to build upon this idea. And it's going to set a series of codes with businesses, codes that businesses have to operate in order to act under the NRA banner. So the NRA could have been radical, right? It could have been the government imposing rules on businesses, which would be seen in certain sectors as radical, but it's not. Because this business code creation is actually done in cooperation with the businesses. And I'll give you an example. The federal government under the NRA said, we need steel industry to start making steel, right? So that you're producing steel and you're putting workers back to work so they have money in their pockets to spend. And the steel companies say, there's so much steel produced and there's so much cheap steel being produced that we can't compete, right? We can't sell our product because there's so much surplus steel that's already been produced. And then you have steel makers who are selling steel that's an inferior quality, but they're selling it for a cheaper price. So the government says, okay, what do you need? And the steel industry says, we can't sell steel for less than $1 a ton, right? So steel must sell for $1 a ton, and it must meet these standards of strength and whatever, right? Purity, strength, etc. And so the businesses help the government write the codes for their steel making sector. This is true across all sectors, so much so that everything has a code, right? So you go to the dog groomer who's operating under code. And the idea is that this is a voluntary effort where you reward good actors helping the country with your dollar bills. And how do you know who the good actors are? They get to fly what's known as the Blue Eagle. So companies that are adhering to the code, which is a voluntary program to the consumer, you are directed to only purchase goods from people flying the Blue Eagle. So if you're buying steel, you go to the company that's flying the Blue Eagle, you buy your steel with your dollars, and the idea is that you're aiding the nation voluntarily. You're taking Tippy for a clip. You see one place that's offering dog grooming for $1, and another place that flying the Blue Eagle saying it costs $1.10. Well, then as good, loyal Americans, you go spend the $1.10 at the Blue Eagle place. The idea is adhering to these codes is designed to attract the patriotic American to frequent your place as opposed to others. And so the codes are designed to help companies get back to work, right? And reward them with the dollars of American consumers. Now, nestled inside this National Industrial Recovery Act is another radical piece of legislation. It's known as Subclause 7A. Now, when you see something Subclause 7A, that tells you that there has to be a Subclause 7B. And the fact that it's a subclause suggests that there's a number of other clauses, and your supposition would be correct. This is a very big, complex piece of legislation, of which one is a Subclause 7A. And 7A is a radical piece of legislation in American history. 7A authorizes and protects the rights of workers to form unions. It's modeled on the National War Labor Board from the efforts during World War I. It's modeled on the same thing, a board who is empowered to help workers in their complaints against owners, and put into statute, it's legal for workers to form unions. This is radical in American history, right? Senator Wagner from New York, he had it inserted into the bill. It's not clear that Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew this was part of it when he signed it into law, but nonetheless, Subclause 7A authorizes the rights of workers to form unions. This is a part of this bill, and it's somewhat radical, right? There's a number of other things that are passed. There's a Securities Act. The Securities Act provides financial information on stock issues. What it did was criminalize producing false information. Whenever you see something made into a law that tells you either, one, you're trying to prevent something that's going on through legislation, so you want it to stop, so you pass a law to stop it, right? That's generally what laws are. But two, sometimes you also get a sense of what people fear might happen, so you pass in the law. I'll give you an example of that. A few years ago, the Oklahoma state government, for reasons known only to itself, passed a law and actually it passed a constitutional amendment saying it's illegal for Sharia law to supplant constitutional law in the state of Oklahoma. Now, future historians are going to look back and say, what's going on in Oklahoma, where there are a bunch of fundamentalist Islamic thinkers who moved into the state of Oklahoma. And when they look at the census, they're going to say, no, this is a reflection of some fears that Oklahomans had about Sharia law, right? So that's something that's put in the law that illustrates a fear rather than a reality. Most laws are designed to prevent real things from happening, right? So that's what the Securities Act. The fact that they criminalize providing fake information in order to sell stocks tells you that before it was criminalized, people were doing it. That's one of the problems with the stock market. People were not penalized. The idea was we let the market regulate, and that the idea was let the buyer beware, right? So when a company put out stock information and said, oh, we're really profitable, if you bought it and it turned out that they were lying, well, now you know. Right? Well, with the Securities Act, it criminalized that. It made the CEO and the CFO and other chief executives criminally liable for producing fake information. The idea behind this is the government wants you to invest the money in the stock market, but they know you're not going to do it if the system is rigged. Another piece of legislation that's passed is known as the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is designed to deal with bank failures. What the FDIC does is it taxes banks to create a pool of money so that if one of those banks goes out of business, they draw from the pool of money to make all the people who put their savings investments there whole. Today, it's up to $250,000, I believe, the FDIC covers. So with your money you've made from selling newspapers as a child, and now you've invested it and saved it, and now you put all your monies in savings, and you have $250,001 in your savings account at your local bank. If the local bank goes bankrupt, out of business, the FDIC will pay back $250,000 of your $250,001 you had there as savings. This is designed to protect people's savings that they were putting in the banks. Again, this tells us what banks were doing. Banks were taking monies from the savings side and then using it to gamble in the stock market. And so when the stock market crashed, the company or the banks went belly up, and they took not only their investment money, they also took your savings money that you put there, and you're out of luck. So the FDIC is designed to protect that. It also mandated that investment and commercial banking are separate. Glass-Steagall was the law of the land until the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration was persuaded by bankers that they could be much more contributing members of the nation's economy if they would repeal Glass-Steagall so they could take money from savings and invest it in the market sector. The Clinton administration allowed bankers to do that. That change bore its bitter fruit with the collapse of the economy in 2007. The 2007 collapse of the economy hurt the banking sector, which was damaged because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. A new form of Glass-Steagall was imposed on banks, and they've been complaining about it ever since. The first 100 days also created a public works program known as the Civil Works Administration. I'll talk about that more in the next lecture, but it is part of the first 100 days. Public works was continually re-upped in various formats. The first iteration is CWA, later becomes known as PWA, and then WPA. They're similar type of things, but CWA is different, and I'll talk about that next time. There's another piece of legislation which is actually not part of the first 100 days, but is a continuance of this 100 days legislation. It's the 1934 Securities and Trade Act. This creates the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and also the SEC, which oversees the stock market. This is designed to protect the stock market and the investors. So what did it do? It criminalized insider trading. If you act on insider information, you benefit, but the market and the investors all are punished, right? So what the Securities and Trade Act does is it criminalizes that. This was something that apparently some notable figures had not been paying attention to. Most recently, a congressman from upstate New York, who's now been sentenced to prison for insider trading on his medical device, that he actually was filmed at the Trump White House on the grounds, on the telephone, desperately trying to reach his son to tell him to dump the stock because the diabetes drug that they were creating, or insulin drug they were creating, did not work. So he has learned the dangers of insider trading, as has Martha Stewart, who went to federal prison for her insider trading. So this is criminalized. Again, it tells us something before. It wasn't criminalized before, as we saw with Andrew Carnegie and his colleagues at the Pennsylvania Railroad. And market manipulation. So purposely trying to make the market move with false information or rumors to benefit yourself is also criminalized. These are all things put in place largely during the first 100 days, except for the Securities and Trade Act. And these are all fundamentally unusual and unprecedented actions, but with one and a half exceptions, not truly radical. All right, so that's the discussion of the first 100 days. We'll pick up next time with more information about the New Deal legislation, and I will chat with you next time.